So the next study that you're going to look at is Gould from 1982. Now, Gould is quite an interesting study in the sense that it's not like a traditional piece of research. So I think it's probably the first one that you are going to look at that isn't a traditional piece of kind of empirical research. And so we have to treat it in a slightly different way. But basically, Gould's research was called A Nation of Morons, and it was looking at effectively the validity and objectivity of intelligence testing. So first we're just going to look a little bit at what intelligence is. So there's just a few definitions here. So you may just want to kind of pick one or two of these to write down. So intelligence in this first definition is seen essentially as a system of living and acting operations. So a state of balance and equilibrium when you're able to deal adequately with the data in front of you, but is dynamic rather than static. Other definitions might see this as being related to how you can adapt to the environment. Some see it as an innate general cognitive ability, and some see it as the ability to deal with cognitive complexity. So intelligence is a tricky one really, because there isn't really a standard definition that every psychologist accepts to be the true definition. So depending on your stance in psychology, perhaps from what area of psychology you are from, so whether you're in the cognitive area or the biological area perhaps, you might find that actually there are different definitions out there of intelligence basically. And because there's different definitions, there's also different theories. Now again, these theories may be useful for you to kind of note some of them down, but you don't need to look into them in any amount of detail, because that is something that you will be doing later on in the course when you look at child. So lots of theories of intelligence, so psychometric or factor analysis theories such as Spearman and Thurston, quite important ones that you'll look at. You'll look at fluid and crystallized intelligence by Cattell. So the idea that you've got potentially two types of intelligence that run in parallel to each other. Information processing approach, and Gardner's theory of multiple intelligences. So again, this idea that perhaps you've got several different intelligences that again are running in parallel. So you can see that trying to define intelligence has been quite problematic, as people can't really, psychologists can't really agree on a standard definition. So researchers tend to focus on testing intelligence in whatever way they think it to exist. So whatever intelligence may be, the focus is generally on testing it now. So a key issue related to intelligence is the one of nature and nurture. So studying whether intelligence is innate or is in fact learned. So the idea behind this first box here is that if it is learned, then we aren't testing an unchanging thing, but something that is a product of somebody's experience. In which case, you should be able to enhance a person's experience in such a way that their intelligence increases. So if intelligence is learned, then the only point of testing would be to work out who needs more teaching, perhaps. However, on the other hand, if intelligence is innate, therefore it is unchanging, because it's biologically predetermined, and then the point of testing would be to classify people. Now, intelligence tests commonly assume that intelligence is innate, so it is a fixed quantity of intelligence, because otherwise there's no point in doing the test. So the tests are there to classify how intelligent you are. Now, how those tests are often administered is their IQ tests. So IQ is the usual test score that is given, and it stands for intelligence quotient. Now, a quotient is the result of a division of the mental age, or your score on the test, divided by your chronological age or your actual age. Now this is done because you wouldn't expect like a 5-year-old to get the same score as a 10-year-old, and therefore if they did, then that would say that that 5-year-old is much more intelligent than the 10-year-old probably is. So you adjust the scores that they get in relation to their age, and then you multiply it by 100, sorry, to get rid of decimals. Okay, so this is the score on the test, divide it by your age, and then you times it by 100, and that's how you get your IQ. So, in terms of Gould's research, you could get asked about the background to Gould's research. So that would include some of these tests that already existed. So I'm going to go through each one individually. So make sure you're writing down the things that I say in relation to these tests. So the first one, the Simon-Binet test. In 1904, Binet and Simon were commissioned by the French government to basically devise a test that would identify children who wouldn't benefit rather from ordinary schooling because they had inferior intelligence. And the result of this was the Simon-Binet test in 1905, and that's generally accepted as the first intelligence test. Then, in 1910, Terman was at Stanford University and began adapting the Simon-Binet test for use in America, and this new test became known as the Stanford-Binet test, and it's been revised a number of times since. And thirdly, you have got the Wechsler test. So they developed the probably most widely used test of adult intelligence, which is the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale, and this was in 1944. Again, this has been revised a number of times since it was first used. Now, the Stanford-Binet and the Wechsler tests are individual tests, so you give them to one person at a time. Whereas you can also have group tests that are administered to several people at once. Now, a major kind of development here was that America became involved in World War One, and as part of the selection and the recruitment of World War One soldiers, they wanted to have a push on group intelligence testing. So the idea behind this was that you would test people who were army recruits, and then you would filter them into appropriate roles. And so the result of this was the Army Alpha and Beta tests. So if you ever get asked a question about the background to Gould, this is the information that you're looking for. Okay, so these Army Alpha and Beta tests were developed by Yerkes. So Yerkes was a psychologist at Harvard University at this time. So this was kind of the early 1900s. And in the early 1900s, psychology was perceived as a soft science. So Yerkes wanted to basically improve its status by demonstrating that it could be as objective and as quantifiable as other scientific disciplines. Now, Yerkes also saw this as an opportunity to prove a theory that he had. So Yerkes believed that intelligence was inherited and therefore it couldn't be changed because how intelligent you are is due to nature rather than nurture. And he also saw this as an opportunity to give psychology the status it deserved by incorporating his ideas of inherited intelligence and the development of mental testing which, as we've just said, at this time was in its very early stages. So basically, he then became a colonel, and with the outbreak of World War One, he developed an idea that it might be possible to use recruits of the American Army as a source of sufficient data to show that intelligence testing was scientific. Now, previous efforts to do this had been insufficiently coordinated or simply inadequate. So Colonel Yerkes now basically managed to persuade the American government to go along with his idea. So it gave him the opportunity to study a large sample to prove his theory of inherited intelligence. So Gould, who is the researcher for this study, aimed to examine the early history of intelligence testing as conducted by Yerkes on army recruits. So that's what Gould aimed to do. So he aimed to study Yerkes's set of intelligence tests. So Gould aimed to identify the following issues in psychology. So in order to study the problematic nature of psychometric testing in general and the problems with measuring intelligence in general. The problem of the theoretical bias influencing research in psychology. So in particular, how psychological theories on the inherited nature of intelligence and kind of then prejudice of a society can then dramatically distort how objective and factual these tests are. And then finally, looking at the political and ethical implications of research here. So how this kind of bias research can be used to then discriminate between people in terms of their suitability for occupation and admission to countries. So Gould is not a piece of empirical research, as I've previously said. So it's important to be aware that this piece of research is a review article, and it is an edited extract from Gould's book. So Gould wrote a book in 1981 that was called The Mismeasure of Man, and he basically traced the history of the measurement of human intelligence from in the 19th century when we would study craniology, and that's a picture of craniology going on just there. So craniology was the measurement of the skull in order to determine your intelligence level, and he started there and then basically tracked all the way through to today's more technical and sophisticated methods of IQ testing. So the purpose of this part of the review that was extracted for this study is to review the history of Yerkes's intelligence testing of recruits for the US Army in World War I and his attempt to establish psychology as a scientific discipline. So the sample in this study was 1.75 million army recruits in the USA during World War One. Now these recruits included a number of races, including white Americans, what you classified as Negroes, and European immigrants. Now Yerkes designed 3 tests, okay? So from May to July in 1917, together with a number of his colleagues, including Terman, who we've previously mentioned, and another researcher called Goddard, who shared his views on the hereditary nature of intelligence, they wrote the Army mental tests. So as I say, they developed 3 types of tests. The first 2 types of tests were designed to be given en masse, so to large groups, and they took less than an hour to complete. So here is the first of these tests. So it is the Army Alpha. Okay, now this test was designed for literate recruits. So in other words, they had a good basic understanding of English language skills and literacy. It had 8 parts, and it included items that we're usually quite familiar with as part of intelligence testing. So things like analogies, filling in the next number in a sequence, things like that. Now, in this box here, you've got some examples of questions asked, and that gives you an idea of the type of questions asked throughout. So Washington is to Adams as first is to blank. So that's about American presidents. Crisco is a patient medicine, disinfectant, toothpaste, food product. Crisco is a food product that's commonly sold in America. The number of a cafe's legs is 2, 4, 6, or 8. So again, this is an American piece of kind of slang terminology. Derogatory, I think, slang terminology, if I'm right. And Christy Mathewson is a writer, artist, baseball player, or comedian. Okay, so just initially looking at that, is that actually testing intelligence? Or is it testing their general American cultural knowledge? Okay, and that is one issue that was raised. So although these tests were considered by YERKES to measure your native intellectual ability, so in other words, intelligence that's not influenced by education or culture, they were in fact extremely biased. So how could someone who was unfamiliar with American culture achieve a decent score if questions were similar to those? Okay, so that's the Army Alpha. The second test that was developed was the beta test, so the Army beta test. So this was a test that was designed for people who were illiterate or who had sat the Army Alpha test and failed it. So this included picture completion tasks. It included cube counting. So here's an example of some cube counting. So how many cubes are there? There, and there. Finding the next symbol. So here's one. It was just X's and O's, and could you work out what the next symbol was in the sequence? Maze running. So that's test 1 there is an example of maze running. And translating numerals, so numbers, into symbols. Okay. This had 7 parts. Another part was kind of this one here. So in this part, this is a pictorial completion task. So this part of the beta test, essentially you had to draw in whatever was missing from those pictures. So for example here you might say that the mouth was missing, so you might draw that in. There's an eye missing, a nose missing, a hand missing, so you draw that on. This one, what was missing was the chimney, an ear, the filament of the bulb, the stamp, I think that one was, violin strings, corkscrew, the trigger, legs, or claws. Oh, that's the return address actually, because it's American, so you'd have the return address on that side. So yeah, strings, corkscrew, trigger, tail on the pig. Like I said, more legs or claws. Shadow of the cat is missing. Ball, because they're bowling, playing bowls. Net on this tennis court. Arm of the ballerina. Speaker, so this is an old kind of, what do you call it, a gramophone, so there should be a large speaker coming off that. There's no reflection of this lady's arm in the mirror. And on this card, there is a diamond missing just there. So again, just kind of looking at those, particularly kind of this part of the task here, you're going to have some kind of cultural knowledge there. You know, what if you are from a culture where the homes do not have chimneys, where light bulbs perhaps are not a form of your culture? Remember, this is the very early 1900s. The violin perhaps is not part of your culture. Neither is playing tennis or a gramophone. Perhaps you've never played cards. And additionally, it still involves use of letters and numbers here. So if you're illiterate, how are you supposed to understand those letters and numbers? So these pictures again are culturally specific, so they'd have been extremely difficult to complete if a participant had no knowledge of some items. And again, like I said, translating numerals into symbols is a difficult code to work from if you have never seen numbers and you've never seen symbols before. And also additionally, another problem is that these instructions were written. They were written in English, and in 3 of the 7 parts of this, your answers had to be given in writing. Now remember, this is a test for people who are illiterate and they may never have even held a pencil before. Okay, so yeah, so not really suitable for purpose. And here is an example, so you can see some of the tasks that they're doing. They're kind of demonstrating here how to actually answer these questions. So there's the recruits listening to the demonstration. There's a demonstration of task 1, so that was the maze running task. Task 2, so that was the block counting. And task 3, which was the next in the sequence. Now, if you failed the alpha and the beta, so you say you sat the alpha and you failed it, so you sat the beta and then you failed it, or you were illiterate, so you sat the beta and then you failed it, then you could be given an individual spoken examination. So that's what you were supposed to have instead. However, this rarely happened. That was the 3rd test. Okay, so when it comes to scoring these, every individual was then given a grade. So this grade went from A to E, but it had pluses and minuses, so you might get like an A plus, an A minus, B plus, B minus. And then these grades were then used to kind of offer suggestions about where they should be placed in terms of their military role. So for example, if you got a C minus, that indicated that you had a low average intelligence, and therefore you might be suitable for the position of an ordinary private to an ordinary soldier. Whereas if you got a D or anything less than a D, then that indicated that you are a person rarely suited for tasks requiring any kind of special skill, forethought, resourcefulness, or alertness. Okay, so you wouldn't have been given particularly good roles. You wouldn't even have been allowed to have been an ordinary private. So there's several problems with how these tests were administered. Obviously, the cultural bias is a problem in itself, but these are problems with the way that the tests were actually done and administered as well. So only a 5th of those who failed the beta test were allowed to take the individual exam. So if you were classified as illiterate and then you took that beta test and you failed it, only 1/5 of those people were allowed to have the individual examination, when in reality everybody should have. There were other problems alongside all these other ones that I'm going to go through in administration, with those who had failed the alpha test not being able to sit the beta test, and that was especially for black men. There were quite long queues for the beta test, because actually what we found was that the levels of literacy amongst Americans, especially black Americans, were much lower than Yerkes anticipated. So Yerkes had set this kind of bar for how intelligent you needed to be and how literate you needed to be to sit the alpha test, and then actually lots of people were below that bar for the alpha test, so they automatically went to sit the beta test. But because the queues were building up, in order to kind of avoid a bit of a bottleneck of lots of people trying to sit that one test, they artificially lowered the standards in order to reallocate more men to the alpha test. But this only happened in some camps, so it wasn't kind of standardized across all camps. So in some camps, the minimum level of schooling was enough for you to sit the alpha test. So in other words, that you had a handle on a few English words would be enough to sit the alpha test, which isn't what you would call being literate. That would mean having a good grasp. Whereas in others, some recruits had to achieve a certain grade at school in order to sit the alpha, so that wasn't standardised. And also recruits who were illiterate should immediately have been assigned to that beta test, or if they failed the alpha test, assigned to the beta test. But this only happened in some camps, and therefore people who were illiterate were just immediately kind of sent to sit the alpha test, and then came out scoring next to nothing, so having a very, very low score. Now, in terms of the results, data was analysed by E.G. Boring, who is Yerkes' lieutenant. So they manipulated the results and selected 160,000 cases for analysis. So that data was then converted to a common standard across the three tests. So in other words, it was converted so that an alpha, a beta, and a spoken test would have been able to be compared with each other in order to look for racial and national averages. So these three, what you would call facts, emerged from those results. So the first fact that emerged was that the average mental age of a white American adult male stood just above the edge of what you would call moronity at a shocking and meagre 13. Okay, so the average age of a mental age, of a white American adult was age 13. So Terman, who we've already mentioned a few times, has previously set the standard at 16. So this indicated that the country was a nation of morons and was taken as such by some researchers to show that, who look at like genetics, to show that the poor, the Negroes and the feeble-minded had been interbreeding and lowering the overall intelligence of the population of America. Okay, so it's kind of twisted in that negative way because it was lower than they wanted it to be. The data also showed that European immigrants could be graded by their country of origin. So people who had darker skin, so people from southern Europe, and what you called the Slavs of Eastern Europe. So if you were counted as a Slav or Slavics if you could speak Slavic languages. So people who were classified as this were people who perhaps came from Poland, if you were Czech, or if you were from Slovakia, Russians, if you were from Belarus, Ukraine, Serbia, Bulgaria, Croatia, Bosnia, Montenegro, places like that. And obviously they would have potentially had different names at that time as well. But yes, so there's just a selection of people who would be classified under that. So essentially, those people were apparently on these tests less intelligent than the fair people of Western and Northern Europe. So you can see that there the averages of the Russian, Italian and Polish were quite a bit lower than the Americans as well. And the final fact that was established from these tests was that the black man had an average mental age of 10.41. So the lighter the skin colour, the higher the score. The darker the skin colour, the lower the score, essentially. So there were some subsequent developments from this. So the test had a large impact upon officer screening. First of all, so I think the oh, click too far. The roles of your kind of position in the military, remember, was assigned based upon these kind of Army Alpha Beta results. So actually these tests ended up having a large impact upon who got what roles. And actually this also meant that by the end of the war, 2/3 of the men who were promoted were those who had taken these tests and achieved good results. So it didn't just initially affect here, like kind of what role you initially got given, but it also affected your progression. Now, according to YERKES, there was also a steady stream of requests from commercial concerns, educational establishments, and individuals for the use of the army methods of the psychological examinations or for the adaptation of such methods for special needs. So, in other words, other people wanted to use them for similar purposes. Other developments that came from this. Now, the fact that was established that the average mental age of an American was 13 was quite concerning, obviously, but I think the most important implication that these tests had were the differences in racial and national groups. Now, bearing in mind that these tests were now accepted as measures of innate intelligence, here was evidence that there really was a difference between racial and national groups in their levels of intelligence. But interestingly, Americans weren't the highest scoring, so Nordic people from Northern Europe were actually shown to be the most intelligent, not Americans. This research was also used in a negative way as well by other people. So Carl Bryan was an assistant professor at Princeton University. So he treated this as evidence in a book, which was kind of propaganda for the plight of racism, really. The book dispelled any possible concerns that might be raised about the accuracy of the findings, using some quite strange reasoning. So it suggested that although some people who were Jewish, remember, they would have come from a lot of the countries where we are saying are lower on the intelligence ranking. So while some Jewish people were extremely accomplished scholars, statesmen, performing artists, etc., they were only noticeable because they were unusual exceptions for the rule. The majority had been assessed as having low levels of intelligence by this research. Okay, and finally there, although the tests were supposed to be accurate irrespective of country of origin or first language, even YERKES actually admitted that these results show that there is a problem for people who are not familiar with English, as the people who were the most recent kind of immigrants had been people who, are kind of speaking very little English, so people who they classified as the Slavs of Europe. So they had the lowest scores of all. And a major kind of subsequent development really was the Immigration Restriction Act. Okay, Now, this was in 1924, and this was passed by the US Congress. And it was essentially, unfortunately, shaped by Yerkes' findings. So basically, people from southern and eastern Europe, from the Alpine and the Mediterranean nations, had all scored quite low, quite poorly on the army tests, and they were no longer welcome in the USA. Now, in order to implement this, data was taken from a census of immigrants. So you do record who immigrates to your country. So we took this census of immigrants to record numbers of people who had immigrated to our country. Now, that was done in 1890. Now, immigration there in that year from kind of southern and eastern Europe was quite low. Now, it was decided that the quota of immigrants allowed into America would be 2% of each recorded nation taken from those 1890 figures. Okay. So if 100 people from Italy had immigrated last year, we are now only going to allow 2 people from Italy this year, for example. So 2% of each recorded nation's figures from that year. Now, Gould makes it clear in his review why they didn't pick more recent data. So this was done in 1924. There was a census in 1920. Okay, so they could have used that one, but they didn't. They picked the 1891 specifically because the proportions of immigrants in 1920 would be different. So there had been more Southern and Eastern European immigrants by then. So therefore, if you'd use that 2% margin, the quota that you're allowing would have meant that there would be a lot more people from those countries allowed. Okay. So yeah, that's why that was specifically picked. And by picking this one that had already a low quota and then reducing that quota to 2% of the original figures, that means that the numbers of people who you classified as the unwanted because of their intelligence levels would be very low. Okay. Now, these immigration acts had quite big consequences. So horrendous consequences in the form of the fact that immigration from southern and eastern Europe was pretty much all but ceased. Now, the persecution of Jewish people, which started well before the actual beginning of the Second World War, meant that many Jews tried to escape from their homeland, but there was this kind of no admittance to America based upon these new figures. So calculations suggest that as many as 6 million people from southern, central, and eastern Europe were denied access to America between 1924 and 1939 at the start of World War II. And obviously the fate of many of those people is then, well known, unfortunately. So in conclusion, there's a few statements that we can give. So Gould concludes that IQ tests are culturally and historically biased, that they do not measure innate intelligence, that it is often unreliable. So remember, not everyone was tested in the same way, and not all conditions were the same. In fact, some were kind of subject to overcrowding and stuff as well. And obviously even the standards that were set for which tests you could sit were not, reliable. IQ tests may not produce valid results, which they cannot if they are not testing what they set out to test. Inappropriate, poorly administered IQ tests can lead to tragic consequences. Nations can be graded by their intelligence, and America is a nation of morons. And finally, we have got this sentence that Gould ended his article with. So this was the end of the article that was taken as an extract for this study. The paths to destruction are often indirect, but ideas can be agents as sure as guns and bombs. So it was his general conclusion that some ideas specifically looking at YERKes' ideas of carrying out mental tests on army recruits in the USA in the First World War, can have consequences which are every bit as tragic and more deliberate and direct attempts to do harm than sometimes guns and bombs can be.